too well.
Welcome. It's great to have everyone with us today. We are coming together today to talk about the future of U.S. defense policy. The United States is helping supply and provide military advice to partners in two wars, one in Europe and one in the Middle East, while also trying to deter or prepare for a conflict in Asia. In 2022, Congress established the Commission on National Defense Strategy to examine and make recommendations on the 2022 National Defense Strategy. 2 years later, they're back at it, and we are really fortunate to have with us today the National Defense Policy Commission. 6 of the 8 commissioners are with us today. As part of its legislative mandate, the Commission will issue a report in coming months to reflect on the U.S. framing of its strategic threat environment and to inform future budget requests, legislation, appropriation, and Department of Defense operations and planning. In shaping this report, commissioners see the solution set as necessarily requiring a whole-of-society approach. For that reason, it seems appropriate for the Miller Center to title today's discussion, "Ask What You Can Do for Your Country." The commissioners are here, and we are fortunate to have 6 of the 8 commissioners with us today because they want to hear from and talk with you on the nature of the challenges and the way forward. These public conversations will help the commissioners shape their recommendations along with the meetings they are having with senior national security leaders, business leaders, members of Congress, foreign allies, and partners. Thanks to the work of 2 Miller Center practitioner senior fellows who are with us today, Mara Rudman and Eric Edelman, we are thrilled to welcome them and other members of the commission with us. So let me start by simply giving you all a quick name ID on who is around the table here, and I'll give more background about each of them as we bring them into the conversation. So please join me in welcoming Chair of the Commission and former Congresswoman Jane Harman, Vice Chair Eric Edelman, General Jack Keane, Tom Mencken, Mara Rudman, and Elisa Starzak. And not with us are Maria Sixkiller and Roger Zackheim. So please welcome them to the meeting. The commissioners are eager to ensure that this is a conversation with all of you. I'll lead off with a couple questions on several different topics for a few of our commissioners. We'll have a conversation around the table here. And then after that, we'll turn to audience Q&A. For those who regularly join our meetings, we often do those by card. Today, we're going to have a microphone go around for people who are prepared to ask questions. And we'll also be taking questions from our viewers online. So let me start with Congresswoman Harman, who served 9 terms representing California's 36th district, was ranking member of the Intelligence Committee after 9/11. After leaving Congress, she led the Wilson Center for International Studies for 10 years and served on a long list of advisory boards for various 3- and 4-letter agencies, the CIA, DNI, DOD, DHS, and NASA. And I'm not going to quiz you on what all of those mean. But we know that at least the last couple national defense strategies describe both China and Russia in similar terms as the primary competitors for the United States. The last one called China a pacing competitor for the U.S., meaning that it remained our most consequential strategic competitor for the coming decade. And it focused on Russia's unprovoked, unjust, and reckless invasion of Ukraine as a sign of its global irresponsibility and termed it as an acute threat. So given this broader defense mission and mandate that we have, how are we doing in that strategic competition? And I'd ask you to start with China, and then I'll turn to Eric Edelman maybe to give us an overview on Russia, and we can have a conversation about those two.
Well, thank you, Bill. I don't need to push
you're all
anything.
set.
This is my first visit to the Miller Center, go figure. But I'm delighted to be here, and it's your birthday, so thank you. Thank you, everybody. Salute him. I also want to salute our two members who are connected here. How smart are they? Eric and Mara. And the fact that 6 of us showed up, including them, is more than any other activity we have done outside of our committee meetings. And maybe it also has something to do with your birthday. I
thank you for the birthday present.
To begin to answer your question, and I assume Eric is going to be pulled into this too, a major point we are going to make in our report, this is a preliminary conversation, by the way. Our report is in formation, and we have some ideas, but we have not completed it. You have hit on many of our topics, but again, it's in formation. A point we are going to make is that the 2022 National Defense Strategy was basically written, if everything wasn't printed, I don't know, before the world changed with respect to Russia, Ukraine, and Gaza, Israel, and this unholy alliance among, and I know you're going there too, Iran and North Korea and Russia and China. I mean, these are new facts, and they are extremely scary and destabilizing. China is the pacing challenge. That is what it's called in the report. It is meaning the biggest challenge. But speaking for me, and I think we're going to go there, it is not the only challenge, and it is not a regional challenge. It's a global challenge. Example, we met with the head of Africa Command, AFRICOM, when we were in Germany. We've done a few trips, and I just want to plug Ukraine. We were there last week, and this is my bravery scarf. I hope everyone in this room supports funding for Ukraine. I know we'll get there. But we met with the head of AFRICOM, who told us that the U.S. military footprint in Africa is shrinking, while China's footprint, not just military footprint, it has a huge military base in Djibouti in the northeast corner of Africa, very close to Yemen and other trouble spots in the Middle East. But while its footprint is expanding through its Belt and Road Initiative, it's built many of the airports, it's done many other activities in Africa to increase its clout. And surprise, surprise, a number of African nations are now neutral or joining other groups in formation, not just the pro-West groups. Same story in South America. We met with the head of Southern Command, and where we have at least 5 countries that have no confirmed ambassadors. Not cool. And the fact that the U.S. has seen China as a regional threat is wrong. China is a global threat. That's point 1. Number 2, and a point we're definitely going to make, as you mentioned it, is that Russia and these other threats are also of extreme importance. I just close with this. I was in the first post-Cold War class in Congress in 1992, and we all thought the Cold War has ended. We won, they lost, the world is going to be peaceful, there will be a peace dividend. Well, it didn't turn out so well. We missed a few things. We missed, just to pick 3 of them, and I wrote a book about this. We missed the rise of China, which didn't want to be like us. We missed the rise of terrorism, which wanted to take us out. And we missed the rise of Russian grievance. And all of that is playing out big time. And then came 9/11. Nobody missed that one. We surged everything into the global war on terror. The GWAT. Well, it was important to focus on that, but we missed the rise of China, we missed the rise of Russian grievance, and we are paying a big price for that. So I think that's enough from me for the moment, but China is the pacing challenge, but it is a global challenge, and it is not the only challenge.
That's really great. So now turn to Eric Edelman. For those here at the Miller Center, you've gotten to know Eric the way that we have. For those watching online, if you haven't heard Eric's long bio and my joke about it before, I'll give you the short version, which is Eric was Undersecretary for Policy at the Defense Department after having served as a National Security Advisor for Vice President Dick Cheney, and before that he'd served under Strobe Talbot. So you can just imagine at the State Department during the Clinton administration, you can imagine the breadth of Eric's political acumen as well as his diplomatic and national security skill. He's been ambassador to Turkey and Finland, two very important countries on the borders of Russia or in the Russian periphery, as it were, as well as having served in our embassy in Moscow and working on assistance to the former Soviet Union back in the good days when we worked closely with them, and has worked extensively on European affairs with NATO. So, Eric, as Jane just said, the last report came out. It came out right after the war in Ukraine began. It had been written largely before it started. What has the last 2 years taught us about our defense posture there, our skills, our capabilities, and the gaps in those skills and capabilities? How are we working with partners and allies? How is it turning out 2 years later?
Well, Bill, first, it's great to be back with you and here at the Miller Center. And before I answer your question, I actually would like to salute our chair, Jane Harman, and also all my fellow commissioners. I think everybody here would be incredibly pleased at a time when Washington is riven by partisan divisions. This commission has been a model, not of bipartisanship, but of nonpartisanship. It's been 8 really great American patriots working on a very difficult problem. It's been my honor and privilege to be associated with all of them, as well as our terrific staff. I know David Granis, our executive director, is here, but also Rafi Cohen and a whole raft of others who have been supporting us, and that's been great. The 2022 NDS describes Russia as an acute threat, and I think it's our sense as a group that understates the challenge that we're facing. Russia clearly is a persistent, reconstituting threat, and that means a couple of things. First, it does throw a particular light on the importance of allies, and notably our most important alliance historically, which is our multinational NATO alliance, arguably the most successful military alliance in history. And so the importance of maintaining that alliance, I think, has been thrown into very sharp relief. Second, I think the events, as you say, that occurred after the writing of the strategy point to a bit of a gap in the strategy, which is the strategy very much focuses on a force planning construct that sees us, winning decisively in one theater and deterring adversaries in other theaters. We're observing now that we're involved in 2 proxy wars in 2 theaters at the same time. And so the potential for simultaneous conflict is very real. As Jane just said, we're facing a global challenge with regional characteristics, with Russia being financed and supplied with dual-use goods by China, procuring millions of rounds of 155 artillery ammunition from North Korea, and having drones supplied by Iran. So this is a metastasizing, multinational adversary coalition that we're facing. And finally, I think the war in Ukraine and the Western response to it has thrown into very sharp relief the deficiencies of our defense industrial base. Right? It's first of all highlighted the enormous volumes of munitions that are involved in modern warfare, and has highlighted the difficulty we have in resourcing that ourselves and among our allies. And that is going to be an ongoing challenge, both for the United States, but for all of our allies going forward.
I'd love to stick with Ukraine for a minute, partly because Jane, you and Mara, David, and others, Jack was there not too long ago, I think, too. You've been there on the ground. How does our defense posture look from the ground up, the ground back? In the early days of the war, we saw shoulder-fired anti-tank systems being incredibly successful. Since then, we've seen everything from drones supplied by us, supplied by Turkey, supplied by North Korea. We've seen other equipment coming in from other countries in all directions. When they look back at the United States, do they generally think this has been the right supplier or an uncertain supplier or maybe a bit of both?
Should I
Sure,
jump in?
maybe Jack?
Well, I think a little bit of both. Certainly, the sophistication in weapons has gone up considerably, from stopping the initial invasion with shoulder-fired weapons. And now we're providing tanks, armored vehicles, long-range missiles. The United States is providing HIMARS about 50 miles in depth. ATACMS, which is Army Tactical Missile System, it's about 100 miles in depth. We have a much longer range that Ukraine wants, and that's close to 300. And they should have it, but they don't. And the sophistication in terms of air defense systems, we have our Patriot system there now, and the Europeans have provided cruise missiles, Germans, the UK, and the French. No, German hasn't provided a Taurus system yet. The French and UK have. So the sophistication in weapons has gone up, quite dramatically. But if you talk to the Ukrainians privately, they're frustrated because the United States held back systems that they requested right at the very beginning. They knew they needed armor systems. They knew they needed special engineer equipment to eventually penetrate Russian defenses. This is back when the war began, looking forward, because their goal was not just to stop the Russians, but to retake the territory lost. And we held back on all of that. And people criticized the Europeans for not doing much. That's just not the facts. The facts are they're all in. And it was the Europeans that forced America to do tanks. It was the Europeans, by providing cruise missile systems, that forced us to provide our much longer range system. And it's the Europeans that forced the whole issue over the F-16, because they had F-16s, but to train Ukrainian pilots on it, they had to get permission from us based on export rules. And the F-16s will arrive summer, probably utilized in the fall. So we have been begrudgingly holding systems back for what the United States will say is because of the fear of escalation by Russia, who brandishes the use of tactical nuclear weapons, and I think that has paralyzed our decision making. The Europeans now have given up on that a long time ago. They don't believe that it's fact-based, that's mostly trying to create fear. But the administration, to this day, is still holding on to that thought process of this is the possibility of escalation, and we have to take a measured approach. So in a sense...
And we've had those systems to give. In other words, as long as they're funded and authorized, we can use them and put them into the field.
Yeah, absolutely. And misunderstood largely by the American people, probably not by most people here, is the money that deals with the military assets. The money doesn't go to Ukraine. What we do is provide them the equipment out of our stock that we have. So everything that you hear that I just mentioned comes out of our stock. And then but the money that's appropriated goes to the defense industry to replace it. And what we get in return, if there's a new system, we get the new system, or we get an upgrade of the old system. So our stocks are not only replenished, but they're modernized as a result of it.
And largely built by American workers.
Yeah. And so the $60 billion, which is on the floor of the Congress being debated, $46 billion of that is for weapons. That'll go to the defense industry. $14 billion is for economic assistance, and that is money that goes to Ukraine or financial assistance. And that I think is what should be debated. But the military situation has always been misunderstood.
Laura.
Thanks, Bill, and really appreciate my fellow commissioners being here for this conversation. As Jane said, the report is very much in the making, and so some of what you're hearing in our back and forth is also as we're kind of going back and forth with each other on it. And Jane and David and me and Roger Zackheim, a commissioner who couldn't make it, but who my fellow commissioners are going to tell I'm speaking on his behalf here, just got back from several days in Ukraine. And so I would second all that Jack has said. I would start, though, so starting from the supplemental, there's clearly, and you feel it on the ground, an urgent need for what we're doing. However, the administration may have calculated risks, and we may have a variety of views on their pacing of what they gave and when. Across the board from Ukrainians, we heard appreciation for what the United States had done thus far, a real concern about our ability to carry through on what our commitments are, and a clearly significant need for what we yet need to provide. The other thing I would say in terms of Jack's point about our defense industrial base is we're seeing, and this goes to your point about having more than one conflict going on at a time, some of what's needed, Israel also needs, and we need to have a certain amount available in the United States as well if things happen somewhere else. And so one of the lessons of this is how much more prepared, to Jane's earlier point, we need to be effective in protecting ourselves in the world. The one other point I would make is on the Ukrainians. We had the privilege of getting to spend a lot of time with Ukrainian businesses that have pivoted on a dime to start producing armored tanks from a company that produced, that did armored cars for banks and things like that in the past. Two different types of drone manufacturers who are ordering off the shelf from Amazon for component parts, some of which are Chinese in terms of component parts, but they are finding ways to go forward. It won't take the place of what they need from us, but it's also impressive, and we have a lot to learn in terms of the culture of adaptation and being able to move at the pace necessary from what they're doing and how they're doing it.
I just was going to add to that. We were in a drone factory, and we saw 3D printers printing basically the skeleton of the drone. And what they lack is they can produce cheap drones for, we were told, $350. But what they lack is advanced anti-jamming systems, which our firms can provide. Otherwise, the guidance systems for these drones, which are remote piloted, won't work. So, you know, where are we? We need to be there with that. And the refrain we heard is, we can protect, we are fighting for our freedom, and we are doing everything we can to manufacture systems to protect our freedom, but we need you too. And I think the U.S. has been too slow. I think Jack is right about being hesitant to provoke a bigger fight with Russia. Well, I think Putin will operate on his own timetable regardless of what we do. And I think it is certainly fair game for Ukraine, which is using its own weapons to do this, to attack inside Russia the installations that are being used to attack Ukraine.
Jack, I want to come back to you and give you a more fulsome introduction. General Jack Keane is the chairman of the Institute for the Study of War, an organization that, for people who have been following the Ukraine war carefully, has been a really important source of research, information, analysis. A member of the Defense Policy Board, he's a retired four-star general who served in uniform for nearly 4 decades, with more medals and prizes that seem possible in that period of time. His final posting was as acting chief of staff, and then before that as vice chief of staff for the U.S. Army and the Joint Chiefs. So you've held these important positions, including in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I want to pivot now. It's been mentioned a little bit, but I want to pivot now to the war in Gaza, particularly given how much time you've spent in your career on issues in the Middle East, and go to a topic that is important in previous reports, and I suspect you'll be coming back to, which is the complex escalation dynamics of modern warfare. We are potentially either in the middle of or on the verge of important escalation in the war in Gaza with the increasing conflict directly between Israel and Iran. And I want to take it back a half step to when the war began in Gaza. Were we prepared for, first from a defense posture standpoint, were we in our military relationship with Israel prepared for the war that came to Israel? And then were we prepared to not just supply weapons, but advice, counsel, including what maybe not to do in how Israel's conducted the war. And then if you could also talk about the dynamics. And I'm going to ask to join in this conversation Tom Minkin, who is president and chief executive officer of another very important think tank, one that Eric is associated with, the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, and as a repeat offender of this body, having served in the 22 and then also I think in 2018 on the Defense Policy Board. He's a professor of practice at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where he earned his PhD, and an officer in the Navy Reserves, having served in Iraq and Kosovo. So Jack, if you could start and
Sure.
bring us to the Middle East and the combination of the forces we supply, the advice we give, and how we think about managing complex escalation.
Yeah, but just let me give you an overview, though. A number of us, Eric, myself, Tom, and we've been on NDS commissions before, and we were on the last one in 2018. So we were looking at Trump Mathis's national defense strategy, and we came away alarmed. A big power competition on inability to meet that challenge. And we felt that we were so challenged that we'd be challenged to win, and indeed we could lose. And there was plenty of evidence to support that in terms of war games. So us, who've come back and got all these classified briefings all over again, now they're more current, I can flat tell you it's worse. Situation's worse. 5 years later, it's worse.
And it was bad from your perspective.
And it was bad then. We were alarmed then. This is serious. And I just want to say a footnote here. Every war game we play with China, the results are horrific. We advertise the United States military as being the most dominant military power in the world. We can project power all over the world. And our leaders say this constantly. But when you get within 1,000 miles of the China coast, the advantage decisively moves to China. And those are realities. And I'm not suggesting that war games are ends in themselves. When I played a bunch of them, and I don't like the results, but they're very useful because they tell you what your vulnerabilities are, what your good things are, what their vulnerabilities are, and things that you can change to make it. I'm not suggesting that China has more platforms in every level than we have, in the air, at sea, etc., than we have. Offensive, defensive missiles included. We don't have to go platform to platform against them. That would be a mistake. We didn't do it with the Soviet Union, but we have to have enough to impose cost. And they got to believe that we have the will to use it. Both of those things we had with the Soviet Union. They outgunned us and outmanned us, and they were almost 100 to 1 on tanks, for crying out loud. It was staggering the advantage they had in terms of military capabilities. But we trained hard right in front of them. We developed new capabilities to deal with their offensive power, and they knew we had the will because we kept showing it to them. We're not doing all of this now. So on Iran, I'm going to let him start, okay? Because I've spoken twice, and Tom is very, very knowledgeable.
Well, no, thanks, Jack. But look, let's actually zoom back even from Iran. I mean, what have we heard so far? We've heard a discussion of 3 major adversaries. We've had a conversation about 3 vital parts of the world: the Pacific, Europe, Middle East. And I want to come back to something that Eric first mentioned, which is a key part of this, which is across 3 administrations now, Democrat and Republican, we've really based our defense planning on a one-war construct, or a 1+ war construct. Before that, going back to the end of the Cold War, we planned for 2 wars. Now, we can argue and debate and discuss how adequately prepared we were to wage 2 near simultaneous wars. But that planning led to a certain capacity, capability that served us well. And unfortunately, we walked away from that. Several administrations ago, successive administrations have ratified that. We have a one-war force in a world where there are 2 wars going on, and those wars, as you said, could escalate, could spread, and then even the most consequential conflict hasn't even kicked off. And so that one-war construct has led to a lack of preparedness. It's led to decision makers having to make some very difficult trades that they probably shouldn't have to make. Should this anti-tank missile go to Ukraine? Should it go to Israel? Should it go to Taiwan? Or should we keep it for ourselves? And I just think we're at a place now where we're having to make trades that the United States, as a global power, should not have to make.
So in order to fill those gaps, and I'm thinking both in that region but also globally, do you take as a commission, do you take a systems-wide approach, or are you focusing on one or two key first steps? Because it's would that there could be a big bang and you could put a whole lot of force into all different systems. In this Congress, it's hard enough to get one package to Ukraine. Sure. How do you build up those supplies and fill those gaps?
Yeah, I actually think, a lot of what we've been talking about is we have to think about what conflict looks like across the board. I think people often go into the military world when we talk about the national defense strategy. It feels far away from people's normal lives, right? You think about China, conflict with China feels far away. I think one of the things that we discovered from a commission point, and this will get to your point, is that we are actually talking about potential threats here at home because conflicts aren't regional anymore. So in a world right now where you can have things that impose cost at home, so cyber attacks on the homeland, you can have things that generate disinformation, you have a whole series of things that can come up here. It's not far away anymore. And we haven't done a good job thinking about, from a societal standpoint, what that means for us and how we talk about defense planning. It's not about having a carrier here or a carrier there. We actually have to think about what defense planning means across society, not just for the defense industry or the Defense Department, or even just for government. And so when we think about that as a commission, what we want to think about is taking an approach that is across society. So that is allies, so it's our partners internationally. What does it mean to be in a potential conflict in a world where threats could be at home, right, for all of us, including for our allies? What does it mean to have industry actually actively involved? We've spent a lot of the world of the GWAT was very focused on
Global War on Terror.
Yeah, the global war. I was pointing back to that was the reference, right? The global war on terror was a very not sophisticated adversary, right? And now we're in a world where you have potential adversaries that are trying to use all of the levers of power to effectuate results. That is a fundamentally different world, and we haven't reshifted our mindset. And so when we think about the Commission's defense strategy, it has to encompass all of you, right? It has to encompass all of society. It has to think about our allies and partners. It has to think about the role of industry and what we play. It has to think about the role of the public and just making sure people are prepared. If a conflict were to happen, what would you do? How do you think about the result? How do we talk about it as a nation? And then how do we encourage some of our political systems to actually work for that?
So Alyssa Starzak is the president and global head of public policy at Cloudflare. And before joining Cloudflare, you were general counsel at the Department of the Army, and you worked in legal posts at DOD and CIA. So as you made this transition from the public sector to the private sector, did that need and gap present itself differently to you? Did you suddenly get outside, give in your security badge and suddenly realize, oh my God, they have no idea what we're talking about or what we need? Tell us a little bit about that transition at a personal level.
Yeah, from a personal standpoint, I think there's a whole world of people who just talk differently and don't communicate well. And I think that we have seen this in the Defense Department. Certainly, the Defense Department has recognized that we need a lot of new technologies. And we have to figure out how to use them. It's not just that you need to acquire them, but then you need to know what to do with them. You need to integrate them into your planning. And frankly, the most recent set of conflicts has been an incredible example of it. So how do you use drones? If you're thinking about a battlefield situation, what does that look like? How do you think about using satellites? What does that mean? What does a Space Force do in that context, right? How do we integrate? What is the role of commercial providers? Those are all new concepts and new things that we have to integrate in. I think from the industry standpoint, as somebody who's been on both sides of it, I've been shocked at how often the two are just coming at it from completely different angles. And I think there's a movement in improving dialogue, but the gap is still really large. So from a small provider standpoint, the Defense Department is really hard to navigate. Hard to acquire things for, a whole bunch of things.
And Jane, you come from Southern California, which turns out has big defense industries out there. You've had
Really?
a career in
Didn't know
this
that.
town.
Okay, well, thank you for
It's
sharing.
not just the movie. It's not just the movie business. It's
No,
the defense business.
well,
Right?
a couple of points to add to what Alyssa said. I think the way we fight current and future wars has totally changed from the way we fought other wars in the past. And I think the Pentagon's pretty good at fighting the last war. And I think that Congress is very good, to the extent it works at all, at protecting the stuff that we fought the last war with. People fight to the death to save jobs in their districts. I know this because I represented an aerospace-dependent job. Little secret, Bill, listen up. Entertainment is one of the economic engines in Los Angeles. The other one is aerospace. And the area that's called the South Bay, which was the center of my district, is the area where rocket scientists, well, they weren't rocket scientists, but anyway, scientists helped win the Cold War. And then, of course, what I started with was we thought we won, everyone else lost, so we downsized the procurement budgets for defense and intelligence. And these triple PhDs were out in the cold. And then we had to invent new strategies, one of which is called dual-use procurement, which means, this is right up Alyssa's alley, that firms can do two things at once. Just imagine. They can make defense stuff, and they can also make stuff for the tech world. Where we still are terrible, in my view, is, one, we do protect the tech, I wouldn't call it technology, we protect the procurement for the last war. We don't integrate technology well. And it's not just that people speak different languages, but the innovation, most of it is in the private sector. And 85% of the technology that's relevant to all this is in the private sector. And we have found it's enormously embarrassing that the lash-up between the private sector and the Pentagon and other government agencies is terrible. And the government agencies cannot integrate innovation at scale. There's something called the DIU, the Defense Industry Innovation Unit, Defense Innovation Unit at the Pentagon. It's a wonderful place. A guy who heads it is fabulous. He was at, I think, Google forever, or Apple, one of those, before coming to the Pentagon. They're both very good private sector firms. Anyway, wherever he came from, he's great at coming up with these new projects. And the Pentagon probably spends 1/1000th of 1% on this stuff.
I want to bring Maura in. So Maura is our James Schlesinger Professor, which Eric had been in the past, which is a visiting professor named after former Defense Secretary and former Energy Secretary Jim Schlesinger, who was an economics professor here at UVA, Jane, before Nixon pulled him up to work on atomic energy. And Maura is running a project here called Ripples of Hope that's looking at a number of different things, but including how we secure critical minerals, how we provide for a secure digital architecture, that is, to make sure that what happens on these things stays on these things or doesn't get taken and moved to somebody else's data center. But even issues like maternal health in the developing world or even here at home. So Maura, as you look at this problem, having served as Deputy National Security Advisor, having served as a Middle East peace negotiator, but also having been out in the world of think tanks, if you had to divide up the problem, how much of it is internal to government and how much of it is in the broader political ecosystem that tells political leaders, prioritize this, pick up the phone. You know, President Obama used to like to say, if Congress doesn't act, I have a phone and I have a pen. I can get the agencies to do things. What does the priority list look like if you're at the White House?
Well, first of all, there's limitations on executive authority, and there's going to be even greater limitations, I think, after a coming Supreme Court decision that I won't go into here. But the Loper case that's before the court now has the potential to severely restrict existing constraints on the executive branch to act. So I actually go back, Bill, and I'll answer your question, I hope, but in the context of the previous question you asked about, are the answers here systemic, or my translation of are there one or two things, are there low-hanging fruit? And you can see the scope of the challenges that we're dealing with makes us struggle in terms of the report, I think, with recommendations. I think we all have an interest in being as concrete as possible, because admiring the problem is something everyone can do. Finding solution sets that hopefully could be executed, I think, are what we're keen to try to do. I think that's probably a combination of systemic and knocking, are there 2, 3, 4 easily attainable things, because otherwise you can get overwhelmed. The systemic issue is, I believe, a significant cultural issue across our government, not restricted to the Pentagon by any means. But there's a lot of reasons, if you're in the executive branch, that you're risk averse. That a lot of incentives certainly when you're a career person and you're in charge of procuring material to come in, you have rules that you have always followed. You have lawyers with Alyssa knows I'm not blaming her for this, but she was one of the in-house Pentagon lawyers who, there's a lot of incentives. You have a Congress watching you. You're not going to take risks. You're not incentivized to take risks in the way that the private sector is. And so one question is kind of how you shift that, because it's very clear. So for example, in Ukraine, they are taking huge risks. These industries they were in the position of no choice, like backs against the wall. How do you get that kind of mindset when you're not backs against the wall, but also peacetime sounds a little too passive for where we are right now? And so I think that's a big picture thing that we're struggling with. The mineral point I actually did want to kind of follow up on, because I started thinking of it at this table when Jane was talking about AFRICOM and our meeting with AFRICOM, because China's Belt and Road Initiative, I mean, I think they're absolutely competitor. I think there are a lot of reasons to be wary of them. I also think you have to give credit where credit is due. And boy, have they been strategic over the last 2 decades. So their Belt and Road Initiative, they've got the African continent wired. They've got, by wired, I mean, they own a lot of the mines, a lot of the resources for minerals that we need very much, not just for our economic, certainly for our economic well-being and for our national security well-being. And they've built the ports to be able to move stuff. They've built the railroads and paid for them to be able to move stuff, and we are behind. And so they control, for example, 95%, you heard me right, 95% of the processing capacity for rare earth elements, without which we cannot make chips. So it's great that we have the CHIPS legislation that we have. It's an important step forward in this country, but we have a big hill to climb. And you've got to kind of slice away at it to get there, but the mineral issue is one of the great examples, I think, of why this is a whole of society issue and challenge, and why we have to figure out partnerships with the private sector as well as the culture of government. And if folks have thoughts, as we're going to questions on what sound like the 2 or 3 easy things, please let us know, because we need to focus on that to give people a sense of how to move forward.
Melissa, I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I just actually wanted to double down on something that Mara said, because you had asked me what was the biggest shift going into the private sector. I think the reality is the private sector is used to trying things and failing and moving on. And it happens all the time, right? Businesses fail all the time. A venture capital fund will fund something. Business doesn't do well, they cut their losses and they move. The Defense Department plans, and they plan, and then they figure out what they want to acquire, and then they think about it, and they put in the requirements, and they go for a very long period of figuring out what they want to build, and then they build it, and it doesn't work the way they want, and then they say, well, how do we fix that? We'll have to put in more money, and we'll have to put in new requirements. And you have a system, going to Mara's point, that's so risk averse and so not willing to just say, this isn't working, move on, let's try something different. And our system has been set up for that for lots of good reasons as a lawyer, right? We want oversight, we want to make sure we're spending money wisely, it's taxpayer money. But practically, it creates exactly the issues that Mara raised, and it's very out of step with the way most entities in the private sector that are not government contractors work.
Jack, if I can bring you in here for, having spent almost 40 years inside obviously serving all over the world, but inside the 5 walls of the Pentagon, and then having spent close to 20 years, I think, out now since you've been out. When you look back in and you see these big gaps, where would you start, including in getting the external support for reform, but also the internal support for reform?
Well, you have to pick the right leaders, leaders themselves who are not risk averse. I am who I am, and many of our leaders, senior leaders, are risk averse, to include generals. If you're managing a war every year, and that's what the goal is, to manage it, you're managing activity, and the goal is not to win a war, and you do that for 20 years, I submit to you that that embeds in you, over time, you're inoculated in terms of risk aversion, and you don't even know it's happening. It's unconscious to you. And we're dealing with that. And I'm part of that. Now, I'm not saying it's not me. But you ask me to look back and be honest about it, of course. That's where we are. We need leaders who are innovative and creative in their DNA. And they're not risk averse, to be in charge and to drive the cultural change which we're talking about here inside the Pentagon. These other branches of government, I'll leave to others who have more
But
experience
the
with.
answer is the same.
But this is the issue.
Yeah.
And it's a fundamental cultural change that needs to take place. And there's plenty of models and examples. I mean, and my God, we're America. We're the most innovative country on earth. You know? So we just got to harness this and get after it right.
Eric?
Bill, I think, all of this starts, honestly, with, to Jack's point, with leadership, and now I mean leadership at the national level. And I think one of the things that's been missing, having served on, the three predecessors to this panel, has been a national political leadership, and I'm indicting both parties here, so I'm being completely bipartisan, leveling with the American people about how serious the challenge we face is, and the degree to which the future of not just peace for us, because as Alyssa was saying, we get into a conflict, it's not just going to be limited to the Indo-Pacific or to Europe. It's going to be happening here. FBI Director Wray was testifying just a few months ago about how the PRC is, on all of our, systems in terms of cyber. They're sitting there waiting, and there will be attacks on the homeland if something happens. So your ATM is not going to work, among other things. And lots of things are going to happen that are going to make your life very unpleasant. We have not been honest with the American public about what we're up against. So in the strategy documents, we have a very anodyne, we're in strategic competition with Russia and China. We're in conflict today, every day, with China in the information and cyber sphere. Same with Russia. We are in, as with proxies, two conflicts right now in the Middle East and in Europe, and our national leadership, both in the Congress and the executive branch, just has not been honest with the American people, both about the scope of the challenge and the limitations we face that we've imposed on ourselves that make it hard to meet that challenge.
Tom and then Jim.
Okay.
So, I think what is needed is a sense of urgency, right? I think the clock is ticking. One of the great things about being the United States is when wars come, whether it's World War I, World War II, or more recent times, they tend to come overseas first. And we have an opportunity to help, to watch, and to learn. And I worry that we're squandering that opportunity, watching what's going on in Ukraine, where there's an opportunity to build back our defense industrial base, watching what's going on in the Middle East. What we need is a sense of urgency. And to tie it back, when the United States has had a sense of urgency, we've done amazing things. So back to that Southern California aerospace industry. Where did that come out of? Out of the interwar period, out of the early Cold War. We built and fielded the Atlas ICBM in amazing time. Why? Because of leadership, starting with President Eisenhower, a requirement system that was just focused on the bare bones things, and then a focus on time, not schedule, not cost overruns, on speeding capability. And if we have that sense of urgency today, and have the leaders to drive the system, we can do great things. But that's missing right now.
Well, when you look back at when the U.S. had a sense of urgency, you have to look back at Pearl Harbor, remember that right before that, there was this huge isolationist move. Even in 1940, the America First movement was in full swing, and lots of people in both parties were trying to talk Roosevelt out of joining the Allies, who desperately wanted us to join them in this war in Europe. We only joined when we were hit. And think 9/11 too, same idea. I mean, there were warnings about the U.S. will be vulnerable to a major terrorist attack. I was on one of the committees that made those warnings. Nobody was listening. Well, 5 people were listening, but nobody, it wasn't, we had no sense of urgency. And then our reaction, I would argue, looking back on it, was to surge everything to this GWAT and ignore all the other challenges. So here we are again, you know, it sounds like I don't know, a Woody Allen movie or something, but it's...
Or Groundhog's Day.
Groundhog's Day. Well, that's probably better. Or your birthday. Whatever it is. But we lack that sense of urgency. And Congress is risk averse, just the way the Pentagon is. What is Congress about these days? It's a re-election machine. And people care more about that. This is a rant against both parties, and I'm still a Democrat, a centrist Democrat, so I'm ranting against the Democratic Party, too. Care more about getting reelected than working with the other side to solve hard problems, because if you work with the other side, you are bipartisan, oh dear, and then you will be primaried, which is a new verb. And that happened to me, my last 3 re-elections, which I won. But nonetheless, I was a traitor and a spy, and I should be in jail, and this was coming from the left of me. Maybe true, but I'm still out and about. But the point is that that is not healthy. And foreign policy and international affairs don't have the same sway as how much does my food cost, and what is the price of gasoline. And I'm not saying these aren't important issues, too, but we have to elevate this environment we're in, this highest threat environment ever, because the weapons are more lethal, and they are already here, as has just been pointed out. We have to elevate that to penetrate people's psyche, to understand why it is important to, on a whole of society basis, up our ability to deter and defend America. Deter our threats and defend America.
And I think we have to get better at making the case, though, that the price of gasoline, the price of your food, the very life that you live in this country is not separate and unrelated from how we're positioned in the world.
Good point.
Right? And I think that part is being lost constantly, including in Congress. And we have to figure out how to tie that together. Bill, you and I have had the conversation about, I firmly believe everything is national security. And economic security and national security are absolutely linked, but we're terrible at how that message gets delivered at home.
Well, one of the questions, and I think this may have come from an online audience, for those in the room, I'm going to now turn to the audience to ask the next question. So please raise your hand and we'll get you a microphone. But I think this question comes in and kind of inverts it. To what extent does our national defense strategy take into account the possibility of homegrown threats? An insurrection similar to January 6, 2021. One thing being debated now that we discussed at a conference here in October is revising the Insurrection Act in the United States so that Congress has more of a say on when we respond to an insurrection, when the president chooses to respond, whether or not there's a time limit on it. Then again, with the dysfunction in Congress being what it is, can we really look to our own Congress to answer these kinds of threats and challenges?
So,
Just one quick thing is that former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis is the person who, early in his term as SecDef, I'm pretty sure, in an interview with a high school newspaper, when asked what the single biggest threat to the United States and to our democracy was, said it's here at home and how we're dealing with one another.
well, I can't top that. I know. I actually think that's true. I think that the challenge on the national defense strategy component of it, though, is the military the right entity to deal with that set of threats? And I think mostly we look around and have made legal judgments that the answer to that is no. That doesn't mean that the U.S. military doesn't have a role to play in defending the homeland. To be very clear, there's also the National Guard component of it, but it's not. For the most part, the U.S. military, so to the point about the national defense strategy, isn't thinking about fully homegrown threats, even if they have a role to play.
So now to questions from the audience. Does someone here have a question? So I'll go to another one in from digital. Spencer Bakich from who is a Miller Center Senior Fellow and also a Professor of International Affairs at VMI to our south.
So, make sure I'm on here. Am I on? Yeah. So first off, I'd like to thank the panelists for their incredible hard work, and we appreciate your service. Thank you very much. My question is about an issue which I'm sure you all have discussed at great length. We just haven't covered it today in today's session, and that is the extent to which the United States national security depends on the strength, the coherence, and the depth of our alliances in particular in the Indo-Pacific. We've made tremendous strides, I think, over the last several years. If you could very briefly talk about what we've done that has been laudable and perhaps some issues where we think more needs to be done. Thank you.
I mentioned, Spencer, in my answer to Bill's question about Russia, that obviously NATO has been an important part in the European side, but you're quite right to shine a spotlight on our bilateral defense relationships in the Indo-Pacific, which are absolutely crucial for dealing with the challenge that the PRC represents. I would say a couple of things. One, first, we've just had in the last 24 hours a very important example of, I think, some very laudatory things that the Biden administration has done, enhancing our ties with Indo-Pacific allies, the visit by Prime Minister Kishida, now the trilateral with the Philippines. There have been a lot of other efforts that our colleagues in the Department of Defense have made throughout, with the Republic of Korea, and Japan together, with the Quad, which is yet another grouping, and very importantly, and I think going beyond even just the Indo-Pacific, but tying it to Europe, the initiative to create the AUKUS arrangement between Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. One of the reasons kind of gets lost in all the discussion about aid to Ukraine, that it's extremely important to pass the supplemental, is that there's a very large chunk of money in there for the submarine industrial base, which is absolutely crucial to delivering on the promise of the so-called first pillar of AUKUS, which has got to do with Australia being able to develop nuclear-powered submarines, but also our own submarine production, which remains one of our comparative strategic advantages vis-a-vis the PRC that we're at risk of squandering because of the deficiencies of our industrial base. And that doesn't get much discussion about the supplemental, but it's an important reason why that piece of legislation needs to get passed.
Well, and just to add to that point, I mean, I think America's Pacific allies are contributors to American security. So in the case of Australia, right? The Australian government has written a $3 billion check to the United States to help bolster our submarine industrial base. That's contributing to our defense industrial base. Australia has established a guided weapons and explosive ordnance enterprise to help build munitions in Australia, not only for their own purposes, but also to support the U.S. and other allies.
They're a key partner in minerals.
Absolutely right. And so, our Pacific allies really are a source of strength, not just key to our effectiveness, but really a source of combined strength.
Can I just add to that? This administration deserves a lot of credit for strengthening our allies and partners in the region. They built on the Quad that President Trump started, and I think that they've expanded. It's quite significant. And so I think everybody would appreciate it. There's no way we can form a NATO-like organization in the Pacific, given the different types of government, the different cultures, the different societies that exist there. We're mostly in Europe. They're, in a sense, homogeneous, despite language and some cultural differences. So that means you have to stitch together things. I mean, there's Japan, South Korea, and the United States coming together. I mean, bringing the Japanese and South Korea together was unthinkable a few years ago. But there is a common objective. There is a common enemy. The one thing I would add, I think that needs to be done, putting my military hat back on here, is that we do exercises all over the Pacific. And they're usually designed in cooperation with one of our allies in the Pacific. We need to stitch some of that exercise program together to focus on what is the common objective here. How do we integrate ourselves to actually fight against a common enemy here? And that is yet to be done. And it's one of the principles of deterrence that we learned during the Cold War that was very helpful to us.
Well, I think it's a very important question, and I'm glad you asked it. One of our visits was to Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii, and we went on from there to Japan, and we met with the Minister of Defense, and we went to an air base, and we met with our embassy, but several lessons learned. China has threatened to invade Taiwan in 2027. We think that should be taken very seriously. All those countries there are much closer to that fight than we are. And they all want to be protected. And there are lots of more things that we can do with them, like co-production, like letting them repair some of our ailing platforms rather than bring them back to the U.S. And I understand the U.S. Workforce needs jobs, but there is a better way to do this. Let's leave them near the fight rather than bring them home. So I think I would commend the Biden administration, too, for focusing on this. It didn't start with the Biden administration. I think a very big missed opportunity was in the last administration that a trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which had been carefully negotiated with many of the countries in the region who are major trading partners of China, a trade regime which would have helped us set the rules in the region, was discarded. And I think we're paying a big price for not having that agreement.
I'd like to stick with that, Jane. I think it's a really great point, and in particular, I want to bring in Mara here and a question that came in earlier, which is, considering the growth of China's Belt and Road Initiative, how can the U.S. regain influence internationally? Like, how do you lean back into this space that we step back from? Do we put TPP back up, the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Can parts of it be cobbled together? Are there things we can do to secure critical minerals?
So I actually think, even though I spent time at the Agency for International Development, that's not where the answer is. And I think that is too quickly where people go. Like, they think in terms of U.S. foreign assistance. And I actually think it's private sector work and investment. But where we need our government to step in is to, in this case, mitigate the risks for the private sector in going into the places that we think are in our strategic interest and our economic interest. And part of the argument we need to make when we are going into key countries in Africa that have mineral capacity is, and we haven't been great about doing this, that we can do it better and have better values in how we execute. We can give opportunities to local communities. We can reduce corruption and graft, and we can do it fast. That's a tall order. But some of the mechanisms we need are not that difficult in terms of what the private sector needs to be able to take and make those investments. So it's some fairly minor tweaks in different kind of financing capacities to be able to do that, and that's where I would start.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I actually think this is a fascinating question because this does get to our whole of society piece. I think what people don't realize and often don't think about is the idea that every time China does something like Belt and Road, it gives them leverage in that country. So if you think about an eventual conflict, what does it mean if a lot of your infrastructure was built by China or is controlled in one way or another? What does that mean for a long-term conflict? And we have not done that strategic thinking, I think is one of the realities of, or not done it as much as we should in thinking about how we look at even what our government's role is across different agencies and make sure we're all sort of heading in the same direction. Because I think one of the challenges, even on the trade issues, they're often not seen as national security issues. You start to look at them through the lens of domestic politics. You start to look at the WTO. You start to look at some of the challenges that have come up recently. All of a sudden, policy is changing. But people don't see that through the lens of national security and appreciate the reality of what it might mean on the ground. And so I think that as we go forward, one of the ideas of the whole of society is really thinking about the U.S. government role, making sure that all of the agencies in the U.S. government are actually pushing in the same direction.
I want to turn to one of our audience members, Mary V. Cannell, who is on the Miller Center Governing Council and chairs our foundation board and was a career federal, after getting her PhD here in diplomatic history and teaching. She then went in to serve at the CIA for many decades, and we were delighted to have her back in Charlottesville at the Miller Center.
I too thank the panel for your work, and I appreciate the discussion today. In my view, as the threat has expanded and gotten more sophisticated, I think the U.S. defense posture has deteriorated, and there are some very basic problems or challenges that face the U.S. today. One of them is weapon systems, both in terms of quantity and quality. Another is military personnel, and not only recruitment, but also retention, and again, quality. And the third has already been surfaced, that is the industrial base. And the concern I have there is that it's independent, and it's not necessarily always in lockstep with DOD and the Pentagon. And the Pentagon doesn't have authorities or jurisdiction or whatever to tell the industrial base what to do or what not to do. And I wonder if the defense strategy addresses any of those issues.
I'll take some of that, certainly. I would agree with most of that. You see what is happening in Ukraine, where young troops on the ground, some of them are in their 40s, frankly.
I think of that as young still, just saying.
Are
Since we're
plugged
talking
into,
about my birthday.
Bill just turned 39.
with an iPhone and an iPad and other technology that plugged into Elon Musk's 5,000 satellites he's got there working on behalf of the Ukrainians. And it's extraordinary how they've been able to advance the systems that they have, create new ones. They have literally blown past a service I'm familiar with, the Army's drone capability completely. We fly a drone around, it's going to cost $30 or $40 million. And it's a big old thing, it's antiquated, and it's really not useful in the war in Ukraine. And they've got all these little things that are flying around, and it costs a few thousand or a few $100. And they're killer drones. They're using them to take down vehicles, enemy batteries, etc. So the technology advancement that they're using, based on their fighting for their way of life, for their children, for their everything, has given them this sense of urgency that we're trying to reach for ourselves. And the Pentagon usually takes a weapon system that already exists and tries to improve that weapon system a little bit. And even doing that's 15 years in the making. That's basically the issue, as opposed to flipping completely to advanced technology. We used to really be pretty good at this. We had DARPA, which is advanced research project we had for years, and they were a forerunner of a lot of modern technology that we all accept, GPS, stealth, internet, etc. But we're so far behind, as described better by others, it's an issue. Personnel, for sure. I mean, when you look at the services, we're shrinking. We're describing a threat that we're all alarmed about, and we're actually more alarmed than we're really telling you, I think. But we are very alarmed. And so the Air Force is at a 40-year low. The Army's heading to a number it hasn't seen since before World War II. This is not all a recruiting issue, all right? And the Navy is going down in ships. Their objective state is 355. But they're going down from, it was 298 to 292, now to low 280. Does this make any sense based on what we're just describing to you? It does not. Now, I will say this. You are wrong on one thing. Retention in the services is very good. It's very high, as a matter of fact. In some services, it's reaching record numbers. So even though the services are smaller and their missions are increasing, and they're spending more time away from home, despite the fact that we're not involved in a declared war, there's huge pressure on them. They feel good about what they're doing. Their sense of purpose and meaning in their lives, and they want to stay with this organization. So much is being asked of them. But we haven't discussed the budget, but we've got to do something with it. We got to get smarter about the money we do spend, like I was just describing, just improve that legacy system. That's going to be hundreds of billions of dollars more to get that system and wait 15 years for it. But The fact of the matter is, during the Trump administration, when they knew they were in big power competition, only 2 years did the budget have an increase. The other 2 years were flat. This is not well understood because we're in politics now and everybody advertises that administration, recovered the military. Not even close to recovering the military. Put us on the right road, but then stopped. We've had 4 years of this administration's budgets that are underwater due to inflation. Propose an increase, but based on inflation, there's less money available. We're not suggesting that money is the answer to all of our problems. In fact, up until this point, we've been suggesting there's other things that are really the answer. But at the end of the day, money does matter here.
And I think
points.
industry.
All right, let me get Jane in.
Yeah,
and
sure.
Tom.
Well, 2 points. Congress operating under continuing resolutions slows down everything and makes it more expensive if we ever get to it. To point out, the last time Congress passed a defense budget on time was 2011. That's when I left, so I think it has to do directly
Direct
with me.
correlation, absolutely.
But the other
And I was 14.
the other point I want to make is a plug for the intelligence community. I mean, something we are doing much better at. I mean, sure, I had a little role in Congress, and we did reform the intelligence community after colossal intelligence mistakes on 9/11 and with respect to Iraq, WMD. But my point is that the intelligence community is better coordinated, intelligence products are better, and intelligence is one of the best weapons we're using to help the Ukrainians. We were all at the so-called SAG-U, now I'm going to forget what that stands for, Strategic Activities Group Ukraine, in Wiesbaden, Germany, where 10 partners and allies work together, including us, and Ukraine receives a lot of help with respect to understanding the battlefield and things like that, and that matters. And the way we strategically declassified intelligence ahead of the fight in Ukraine was enormously helpful. So there is something we're doing right. Just wanted everyone to feel
That was
a
a
little
piece
better.
of innovation. Tom and then Eric, and we're getting very close to the end. There are more questions coming in. I'm going to encourage people to stay afterwards. A few people like Jane have to leave almost immediately after the event. But to the other commissioners who can stay, I know there's a lot of interest in the room. So Tom and then Eric, and we'll bring it to a
I was
close.
just going to say, in a free market economic system, industry responds to incentives, and whether it's those incentives come from the government, they come from the private sector. I think part of the problem with the relationship between government and industry is too often it's a dialogue of the deaf. So the government, and I'm saying executive branch and legislative branch, is a horrible customer. A horrible customer, horrible at sending signals to industry. We've been talking about munitions and the munitions shortage. Government, both executive and legislative branches, has been sending horrible signals, inconsistent signals when it comes to industry, when it comes to munitions. It's just one example. Industry, for its part, defense industry, we have the defense industry that we wanted. The defense industry grew up around the whole mountain of government regulations that bind it. And so if we're dissatisfied with that, I think we should look at those incentives, look at those regulations, and then as we try to broaden that industry to a greater part of our economy overall, we shouldn't be surprised if those folks don't exactly know how to speak government or what the government wants. We need to do a better job of bringing those worlds together.
Yeah, just a couple of additional points on the defense industrial base. I mean, I think we cannot underestimate how big this challenge is going to be to get this right and get it fixed. Bill LaPlante, the Undersecretary for Acquisition, is busting his butt to try and increase production levels for a variety of different munitions. But, we've had industry is not now what it was. I mean, we just this past week we're celebrating, the Rosie the Riveters, the women who were involved in defense production in World War II. I mean, we don't, industry doesn't operate that way anymore. We're operating in a world of just-in-time deliveries and extended supply chains that can be very easily disrupted. To Tom's point, industry, rightly complains that they've seen the defense budget go up and down. For them to expand capacity requires investment in plant, and most important, in highly skilled and trained workforce, because this activity is not just kind of like rolling Model Ts off a production line. And we don't have that anymore. I mean, we've got a couple of defense programs that are, experiencing cost overruns and delays, not because we don't know how to design a new missile, but we have trouble pouring concrete and having welders to be able to, and electricians to do, that work, which gets back to why this is a whole of society problem. And finally, even if we get all of that fixed in the United States, we're not going to be able to produce enough to solve the problem. We have to be able to have industry partner with industry in Europe and in East Asia. And, this is really, where POGO comes into play, because we've met the enemy and it is us. We have created a series of obstacles to defense cooperation. Supposedly, we changed some of these laws and regulations to facilitate cooperation with Australia and the UK as part of the AUKUS deal. If you talk to our UK and Australian colleagues, they'll tell you we're still facing enormous red tape and delays in trying to get that done.
Well, let me, Eric, thanks for ending on a down note. I was kind of feeling a little optimistic about the...
Happy birthday.
Well, exactly, it's how I should feel. I want to thank you all. What leaves me optimistic is this group. Several people have mentioned it, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be said again. The idea of people coming together from a range of different experiences, yes, different political, having served in different administrations, under different presidents, in different parties, but really your commitment to service and your commitment to making our country stronger, safer, and doing so in a dynamic, innovative way, I think is a really important message. So thanks to all of you for not just joining us, but for the work you're doing, and to David Granis, the Executive Director of the Commission, who I'm sure, having done that kind of job before, we can't thank you enough. The credit never goes to the person behind the scenes that's really making sure everybody's showing up on time with the right materials. And with that, I'm going to close by thanking the group that makes these events happen: Christina Lopez-Guatardi-Chow, Mike Greco, and the whole AV team, Kelly McCaskill and our development team, who really are our ambassadors to the local community. Thank you all for these terrific events, and to the 1,000 or so people that are watching online and will be watching, thank you for joining us. It's an engaged and informed citizenry that makes our country special. So thanks.
Thank you.